In this episode, 5 friends set sail on a luxury yacht from Maine down to Florida. Tragically, just a few days after setting sail, the crew is hit by a fierce storm that sinks their boat in the middle of the ocean. As they cling onto a small life raft for days on end, they are slowly, one by one, eaten alive by sharks. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying shipwreck shark attack on Captain John Lippoth and his crew. Welcome to Final Affliction. Sailing the oceans on a luxury yacht sounds like the perfect way to spend a day or two. But what do you do when the yacht gets caught in a severe storm miles from the nearest land? Hopefully, the situation doesn't turn out like it did for Captain John Lippoth and his crewmates. It was a clear, sunny day in October 1982, and Deborah Kiley was excited to complete a job that she had been given. She had been tasked with transporting a luxury 18-meter yacht from Maine to its new billionaire owner in Florida. Deborah was a confident sailor and had even competed in the 70,000-kilometer Whitbread round-the-world race, now called the Ocean Race. She even became the first American woman to complete the event in 1981. The 24-year-old woman was joined on her journey aboard the yacht by a group of her friends. There was the captain of the ship, John Lippoth, his girlfriend, Meg Mooney, and friends Brad Kavanaugh and Mark Adams. The day was perfect for sailing, with clear, bright blue skies. Deborah couldn't have asked for better conditions to set out on the luxury ship. The journey was to take 6 days long and be over 2,000 kilometers, so the group of friends would have plenty of time to enjoy the yacht and simply relax as they sailed to their destination. But things didn't exactly go to plan. 2 days into the journey, the skies above the group of 5 began to darken, and, in the distance, a brewing storm crept ever closer. By nightfall on the second day, the yacht was caught in the middle of a severe and violent tropical storm. The storm was so bad that winds up to 110 kilometers per hour and waves 10 meters high battered the yacht. Deborah had been sleeping in the cabin when the panicked voices of her friends awoke her. Rushing to the deck, the young woman was horrified to see that their captain, John Lippoth, was lying drunk at the wheel of the ship. Immediately, all 5 of the friends began screaming in fear. With the amount of water that was rushing over the yacht, the group knew that the worst possible thing was happening. They were sinking. With no other option, the group of 5 jumped off of the sinking yacht and into the rolling waves below. However, just before Meg was able to escape, she lost her footing and fell into a sharp part of the ship, cutting her legs severely. But with no time to do anything about it, the woman jumped into the water with her friends. Thankfully, Mark had been able to grab an inflatable dinghy, which the terrified group of young men and women clung to as they watched the 18-foot yacht sink beneath the ocean, never to be seen again. Acting quickly, all 5 crew members clambered onto the dinghy, but as Mark pulled himself into the boat, he felt something hard nudge his leg. Once in the safety of the dinghy, the group peered into the dark water below them, where Deborah was just about able to make out the shape of something that looked like a torpedo. Thinking that it was a fish at first, the young woman was horrified to realize what the creature actually was as it swam closer. Swimming just below the surface of the waves were hundreds of sharks. The animals had been drawn to the group as they had smelt the blood seeping from Meg's wound. Hungry and ready for a hunt, the sharks rammed against the dinghy from all directions. All Deborah and her friends could do was hold on to the small life raft and pray that they would make it through the night. As the hours waned on, the storm gradually faded and daylight broke through the darkness of the night. At first, the group of 5 friends were relieved. They believed that they would be able to get to safety in the daylight, as surely someone would be able to spot them in the dinghy. But as the hours passed by and all that Deborah and her friends could see was the never-ending expanse of blue sky and ocean, their hope quickly began to disappear. By the 3rd day of drifting aimlessly in the ocean, The group of 5 friends had no hope at all. Meg's wound had become seriously infected, leaving the young woman dealing with a severe case of blood poisoning. If she wasn't able to get help, and quickly, it was likely that she wouldn't last much longer. As well as that, everyone on the dinghy was starving and unbearably thirsty. And with so much water all around them, it wasn't long before John and Mark decided to brave the salty taste of the ocean and to gulp down as much as they could. The problem with this, though, is that the salt content in seawater is much higher than what can be processed by a human body. And because water is needed to process the salt in the body, it actually leaves the person more dehydrated than before they had a drink. After a few hours, both Mark and John had begun suffering from the side effects of the salt water. The severe dehydration that they were enduring led them to begin to hallucinate. John Lipoth was the first to succumb to his hallucinations. He claimed that he could see land far off in the distance. Unable to persuade him otherwise, the rest of the crew could only watch as their captain dove into the water and began swimming towards the land that only he could see. As the group of 4 watched John swim away, they all jumped as a scream tore through the air. The blood-curdling scream only lasted for 1 moment before silence descended once again. Deborah and the rest of the crew knew what had happened. The sharks, which had been lurking underneath them for days on end, had finally gotten their first meal. Horrified, Deborah, Meg, and Brad sat frozen in the dinghy, unsure of what to do next. But Mark was none the wiser. Lost in his own hallucinations, Mark stood up and told the rest of his friends that he needed to run to the store to buy some beer and cigarettes. Then, ignoring the panicked pleading of his friends, he stepped off of the dinghy and into the water. However, this time when the sharks attacked, Deborah and the other 2 crewmates were able to see a lot more. Because of how close Mark was to the life raft, the rest of the crew were able to feel as the great whites rammed into the boat underneath as they tore apart and bit into Mark. Every bump and rock of the little dinghy had Deborah crying. She could only imagine what was happening beneath her, how the sharks were sinking their 2.5-inch razor-sharp teeth into Mark's body and ripping him apart. The young woman never imagined that something so horrific would happen to her, and she was terrified that she would end up in the same situation as Mark and John. The hours passed by with Deborah, Brad, and Meg lying in the dinghy, full of a faded mixture of urine, pus, and blood from Meg's wound. It was clear that things weren't looking good for the young woman. Her wound had become so infected that her leg had actually started to turn black. Eventually, as the 4th day rolled around, Deborah Kiley and Brad Kavanaugh awoke to find that Meg had passed away from her injury sometime during the night. Now, when people are stuck in extremely difficult situations, it can lead them to think about doing things that would never usually cross their minds. And with how hungry and thirsty he was, Brad couldn't help but contemplate eating Meg's body. It had been 4 days since he had had anything to eat and drink, and the young man knew that he couldn't continue to go on without eating her, or he would surely die too. However, Deborah was able to get him to come to his senses. She told Brad that eating Meg was out of the question. Not only was she their friend, but her infection was so bad that it was likely that it would do more harm than good to cannibalize her. But the 2 remaining friends also knew that Meg's body couldn't remain in the dinghy with them. Her wound was oozing pus from the infection, and if even a small amount of it got into Brad or Deborah's blood, then they would also become severely ill. With no other option, the 2 remaining survivors stripped Meg's body of her clothes and jewelry. They wanted to give the young woman's family something to remember her by. Then, after reciting the Lord's Prayer, Deborah and Brad gently pushed the body of their friend overboard. Not wanting to listen to the sharks devouring another one of their friends, Deborah and Brad went straight to sleep. By the 5th day at sea, Deborah and Brad had given up all hope of being rescued. Seeing all of the blood and other bodily fluids in the boat, the pair of survivors decided to try and clean up the dinghy. As Brad was trying to empty the raft, though, a rogue wave suddenly had him tumbling over the side of the boat and into the shark-infested waters below. Panicking, as neither he nor Deborah wanted the sharks to attack again, Brad tried his hardest to clamber back into the dinghy, but with how exhausted and weak he was, Brad was unable to lift himself up. Resigned to his fate, the young man clung onto the side of the raft, waiting for the moment when he would feel the painful bite of one of the sharks. Right at that moment, though, off in the distance, both Deborah and Brad spotted what looked to be a cargo ship. After confirming with each other that it was real and not a hallucination, Brad became reinvigorated. Seeing how close he was to being rescued, the young man managed to haul himself back onto the life raft. Once safely back in the dinghy, Deborah and Brad began yelling as loud as they could for help. After the cargo ship was close enough and had spotted the pair of survivors, they lifted both Deborah and Brad out of the water and onto the safety of the ship. Safely on board, the two survivors learned that they were 140 kilometers south of Cape Lookout. This meant that they drifted almost 150 kilometers off of their original course. But the ordeal wasn't over for the two of them. Those fateful 5 days at sea changed Deborah and Brad's life forever. For years after the incident, Deborah couldn't close her eyes without hearing the screams of her friends as they were eaten by sharks. She went on to write about her ordeal in 2 separate books, whilst also becoming a motivational speaker about surviving against all odds. Sadly, in 2012, at the age of 54, by causes unknown to the public, Deborah also met her final affliction.